The following is an abridged excerpt from an interview acclaimed author David Foster Wallace gave on German television station ZDF in 2003. Sometimes reading requires sitting alone by yourself in a quiet room. I have friends, intelligent friends, who don't like to read because they get not just bored, there's an almost dread that comes up about having to be alone and having to be quiet. And you see that when you walk into most public spaces in America. It isn't quiet anymore. They pipe music through. And the music's easy to make fun of because it's usually really horrible music, but it seems significant that we don't want things to be quiet ever anymore. To me, I don't know that I could defend it, but that seems to me to have something to do with when you feel like the purpose of your life is to gratify yourself and get things for yourself and go all the time. There's this other part of you that is kind of almost hungry for silence and quiet and thinking really hard about the same thing for maybe half an hour instead of 30 seconds. So that doesn't get fed at all. It makes itself felt in the body and a kind of dread in here. And I don't know whether that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think it's true that here in the US, every year the culture gets more and more hostile. And I don't mean hostile like angry. Just in it becomes more and more difficult to ask people to read or to look at a piece of art for an hour or listen to a piece of music that's complicated and that takes work to understand because, well, there are a lot of reasons, but particularly now in computer and internet culture, everything is so fast. And the faster things go, the more we feed that part of ourselves, but don't feed the part of ourselves that likes quiet, that can live in quiet, that can live without any kind of stimulation.
The mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. Frank Herbert from the novel Dune.
Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
26 years ago, at my 16th birthday party, I was given the novel The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. The book is about Lyra, who's an 11-year-old girl from Oxford, and her journey into adolescence, a veritable crossroads of self-actualization, responsibility, truth, and justice. This also all happens to coincide with Lyra encountering armored polar bears, malicious agents of religious dogma, and a portal into another world. So this past December, I found myself reading what Pullman stated would be the final chapter in Lyra's story. Now, years before the Rosefield even arrived in bookstores, I began to consider what it has felt like to live much of my life with this very electric, seemingly very vital thread to Pullman's writing and his characters. But it's not just his work that has enlivened my perspective and curiosity and passions for all these years. As a lifelong reader, I can attest to the joys of reading thousands of novels and comic books and nonfiction that now take up a seat at the table of my inner kingdom.
There is indeed an incredible and utter sense of joy when we enter into a world of words. Not only did we want to take today's episode to speak about what inspires us, we also want to speak to the aspects of it that challenge us in terms of content, but also challenge us within the act itself of reading, as David Foster Wallace alludes to. Just the act of reading itself on some level in this age could be seen as revolutionary, right? So to read a book, an author that in many ways we don't align with, and yet are capable of recognizing the element of truth that they bring forth as well, is a key piece to this. When a writer or an aspect of the content that they present to us challenges us, it allows us to broaden our perspective. I hear it often said that travel, in the sense of seeing the world, does a similar thing for us as humans. And I would offer that words do the same thing when presented to the interested or curious human. We become expanded by the world that's the author's passion. And I think that when we allow ourselves to read in a way that's not a harried pursuit, but rather one that we can, to some degree, luxuriate within, we enter into a world of mystery that can be deeply felt and simultaneously life-changing.
I love how you put that, Martin, in the sense that reading is similar to travel. And as you gain experience, right, there's that intuitive quality to the exploration, to what you know, and being open to those mysteries. They go hand in hand, whether we're talking about a visit to another country or a novel in a genre you've never read before. And I think that's something that's really key to meeting the challenges, being open to the challenges because we recognize the joys within. And I know that there's a quality that arises there. As a lifelong reader, I know how it feels. Sometimes there's an effortlessness when you deeply resonate with prose. You just dive right in and it feels like meeting an old friend and a new lover all in the same breath. And there's just this full body yes to it that's so beautiful. And we experience that in many walks of life, but to be open to that and willing to feel that in a very quiet way, in a very inward way, I think has become a challenge. So in that sense, you open yourself up to and give yourself over to that spaciousness within, right? And where your wisdom and your imagination, your empathy and your curiosity, you're nurturing those parts of self. There's a childlike wonder to it, I think, at times. There's the beginner's mind, Shoshin, involved in it, where you're engaged in each step and ready to leap. And before you know it, you take the leap. So we're talking about the challenges and the joys. And in regards to that inner spaciousness, I think in our present culture, it's worth mentioning that that may not feel all that accessible. It may seem that that spaciousness of engaging in just reading a book, whether it's a good book that you deeply resonate with effortlessly or something that might challenge you in some way where you are sitting with it and feeling through that challenge, that would appear, I think at first glance, to have been replaced by anxious, agitated scrolling on social media. We've talked a lot about an inner practice, our disconnected and dissonant culture right now in so many episodes. So we don't want to focus on that so much. And neither do we want to have a totally data-driven conversation around the state of not only literacy, but also illiteracy and really to a larger extent, media literacy, multimedia literacy in the US. Nor do we wish to lose ourselves in, as we were building the episode up and talking about things, what we found can be reactionary hate or just very hard-edged reactions towards literature from other times, towards perspectives and truths from other times that might be hard to sit with now. But we would like to take note of a few things.
So this question of media literacy, it has a lot of expressions, a lot of offshoots. What does it mean to be literate in the sense of understanding the cultural and historic basis of something that was written decades or centuries ago. But there's also, on a more contemporary basis, what does it mean to be aware of the world around us as it pertains to things such as Black history or the language used, for instance, within the queer community, or the recognition that at any point in time, there's aspects of culture that are shifting or changing, and that there's a way to stay aware. And part of that is through reading. Part of that is like being open. This conversation brings me back to an experience I had when I was in college. I took a mini-mester course, which is a 3 to 4 week long course that fit in between the fall and the spring semesters. And it was a feminist perspective on science fiction and fantasy, primarily science fiction. So, two writers and books that stand out from that experience were Ursula K. Le Guin and David Brin. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, and David Brin's Star Tide Rising. In many ways, I fell in love with the subject matter, the books themselves, and within the class, I found myself listening in ways that I probably had not listened within a class so keenly, because I was learning about a cultural reference point that I knew very little about as a heteronormative male, right? I didn't know this world of feminism in any way, shape, or form, but was very curious about it. And it was simultaneously, I was curious and listening deeply, but also to some degree intimidated. I was intimidated by, I knew for a fact there was so much ignorance or a lack of knowledge around the subject matter itself, and that almost anything I was bound to say would fall into some hole. And I know that this comes up a lot amongst white males today. They feel like angry that there's no space for them to be them, rather than recognizing there's this amazing opportunity to grow further as human beings. And I felt both of those things in the midst of this course. I felt both shoestrung by the inability to sort of find and articulate thoughts. So I largely stayed away from the feminist aspect of the subject matter. And one of the great things about Startide Rising was the fact that in many ways it wasn't chosen because of its exploration of gender, but rather its exploration of cross-species sentience. It was a part of what Brin was exploring about what happened when a dolphin interacts, a sentient dolphin is interacting, and how is that dolphin treated by the human beings, and where are the biases, and how do they show up? It was fascinating because in many ways he was using dolphins as a way to kind of explore the kind of biases that we all know we have. And as I repeat over and over again, the perspective of Ibram X. Kendi, which is, if we're not being an anti-racist, we're not really in touch with what our own sense of bias is, right? And that everyone, regardless of color or gender, we all have biases that we need to explore and bring to the light of day. And that's what this feminist science fiction course felt like. It was like this blowing up within me of a lot of cultural belief systems that I had, and it was a bit like a slow release capsule. And I think that that's what literature and reading in general can offer us. This willingness to not know, to not be sure, to hear the truth as the writer is presenting it without it necessarily being our truth. Right? There's a quote that I'm wanting to share. It's from Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. It was made into a movie by the Wachowski sisters. And in it, there's a quote from a character, a clone. Again, another example of someone treated as less than human because they're being cloned. So another sort of way in which science fiction takes these subjects and challenges us in ways that are unexpected, because not only is Sanmi 451 female, but also a clone. So then the culture within that universe is seen as less than human. What she shares becomes a kind of, it ultimately becomes a dogma and doctrine unto itself over time, as we see explored through the book and the movie. But the quote is, "To be is to be perceived, and so to know thyself is only possible through the eyes of the other. The nature of our immortal lives is in the consequences of our words and deeds that go on and are pushing themselves throughout all time. Our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we are bound to others, past and present, and by each crime and every kindness, we birth our future." I hear those words and I feel in the very fiber of my being, I feel the truth of it. But I also know that to some degree, there's nuances to that statement. There's personal truths that interface. And, when she says it's only possible through the eyes of the other, I go, maybe, right? And so me saying maybe doesn't mean that what I just shared is any less true. It just means I've explored it within myself and known it to be, felt its truth, but at the same time felt its truth, and to some degree felt it in ways seeking to make it my own. And as I make it my own, it alters, it changes. So I can embrace almost all that she says in that paragraph, and yet at the same time know and feel that my personal truth is a little different. So shifting gears a bit and coming back into the broader subject of literature, but also its interconnectivity with all art forms and intrinsically connected to this notion of our own personal truth, I think it's important to develop not only our personal, but also our shared sense of media literacy. What does it mean within the queer community? What does it mean within the Black community? Can I find a shared language? And I think that's part of what this media literacy question brings forth. It means, to some degree, being willing to judge something from the time it was made. I think often of Frank Herbert's Dune. When the Dune movie came out, a person I know, a colleague, was deeply critical and, very opposed to what's depicted in the movie. And when I presented to this individual the recognition that if you look over at the breadth of the work, there's really an enormous amount of empowerment of women and more broadly of the divine feminine within the Dune universe, it can be seen through a different context. And when I did that I was basically stepping on her, that I was mansplaining. I had been very, very sensitive to how I spoke it. And I realized that in that particular instant, it really wasn't about me. It wasn't about an agenda for that person that needed to be spoken. And doesn't make them wrong. It just means that part of the picture they were willing to look at was different than the one that I was willing to look at. We were looking at different pictures. I was looking at the breadth of Frank Herbert's work, having read all of it, and going, this is one thing. And then this person was looking at the first half of a book made into a movie. It brings us back to this notion of media literacy. And I think that one of the pieces that needs cultivation is a willing to nurture that media literacy in such a way that if there's that sense of deep caring, as if we're taking care of a child, then there can be something of that that can be cared for and preserved. And it makes it really tough when we're in this age of plagiarism, state-sponsored, corporate-sponsored plagiarism, that the very art forms that we're seeking in our conversation here to nurture, to care for, are being blatantly stolen, all for the sake of profit. And I think part of what is allowing that to happen is that very real and undercultivated ability of humanity right now in its ability to express itself through literacy, through the ability to process information.
And this is the thing, Martin. You speak to not just the lived in experience and the need to nurture our connection to art, whether it's doing the movie or doing the novel, but the processing, our ability to process this and it gets beyond just that. But, as we consider this practice of nurturing, I want to turn back to the data for a second so we can dive a little deeper because it ties into what you're speaking to in terms of the dissonance, the disconnect, the plagiarism, the way of resonating and finding empathy between different times, different groups, different perspectives. So, according to PIAC, the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, in the United States, as of 2023, approximately 45 million US adults are functionally illiterate. They read below a fifth grade level. The average adult reads at a seventh to eighth grade level, just to give you that context. And this aspect of it really speaks to not just problems of inequality in class and education and how people feel invigorated and proud and confident in their ability to read, but their curiosity and desire to read, right? Half the adults in the United States do not read a book within a year. So, this is one of the fundamental things when we started talking about doing this episode a few months ago, and then looking into the data and seeing how there's this really significant gap that can be there in simply someone's willingness to step into and experience the joys and challenges we're talking about today, right? If people are somewhat incapable of comprehending, of processing the words, basic information that they're reading, then they're likely unable and perhaps even scared or uncomfortable about what's beyond just the words, the meaning. And this is where it feels like a loss of our humanity. When you step into a book, sit down with it in quiet with yourself, the meaning, the feelings and characters, the themes and the stories within the words. They're so potent, they're so powerful, as you've noted with your experiences with Le Guin and with Bryn. If we don't practice not only our willingness to nurture literature in our cultural collective, but if we're unwilling to practice our own personal engagement with it, we lose so much because in books, we mourn and we question and we wander in that quiet, right? And it's expansive.
I love how you just put that. In books, we mourn, we question, we wander.
We wander, not just wonder, right? But we're able to wander.
That's beautiful, Ben.
And so again and again, as we keep saying like 10 times over in today's show, by reading, we're not only experiencing ourselves, but the world and its many truths like we're talking about, and those challenges. So we've come to this really incredible point where I want to acknowledge something that happens when we're willing to step in to reading a book. There's integration. There's something of intertwining that mystery and that joy and that challenge. They all become this delicious journey. We've talked a lot about what brought us to today's episode, whether it's my 26 years of living in and out of Philip Pullman's novels, or these incredible touchstones and portals that Ursula K. Le Guin and David Brin and Frank Herbert have offered you. I'd like to go back and talk more about early experiences in life.
I know for me, I look back, I was an incredibly avid reader. My earliest memory of reading is being punished and sent to my room, never really feeling like I was being punished because I was enjoying the books in my room. At that point, they were basic readers. I was in many ways exploring the images. My mother as well was an avid reader, so it helped that her love of reading fed my love of reading, right? My mother had a friend who subscribed to Reader's Digest, would send out these volumes, and they were condensed versions of books. And so the books would first go to it was actually my godmother, Helen Johnson. My mother and I would pick through them and pick out the books that we wanted to read, right? And they were all mostly condensed versions of contemporary novels, and some of it was older classics. I remember having watched on TV Sherlock Holmes, the Basil Rathbone version, and being totally fascinated by the mysterious aspects of that world. So I wanted to read those books, the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle books. So, up to the library I would go. It was funny. So in the early 70s, even though these movies had already been out in the theaters, I remember it would be a big deal when the James Bond movies would appear on regular TV. And, it was a bigger deal because they wouldn't come on till like 8 o'clock at night, and I was still young. So it was a big deal for my parents to let me stay up and watch all of the James Bond movie, right? And, filled with misogyny and everything else. But at the same time, these exotic locations, and it was a mind expanding, world expanding place, a reflection of that time and that place, and obviously filled with its own enormous biases, but it was mind expanding. So I remember going out and getting as many of the Ian Fleming James Bond novels as I could get my hands on. And they were all fairly, short books. They weren't these big, thick volumes, and you could roll through them quickly. But yeah, that was a lot of my early reading. I would get Sports Illustrated every week, and every week I read that cover to cover. Sports Illustrated would include these special offers with the magazines. They would be these, books that would be like the great quarterbacks of the NFL. I'd put together enough money to buy these books. And so there would be, a 200-page book with maybe 10 to 20 pages put to 10 different quarterbacks. And I would be, I ate it up, reading these books. Gosh. And then I remember through school, we would get these, I guess through some kind of interscholastic reading organization, you could get a series of books. I remember getting Sounder that way. So it was like all of that, kind of all the different ways that as a young person I would find reading. Well, the funny part is that bookstores really weren't, being a suburban kid in Anne Arundel County, bookstores really weren't a big part of my life. It was very library based for the most part, or hand-me-downs, right? When I did end up in a bookstore, because I was in some urban center, it was like big, expanding kind of, it almost felt a little overwhelming. It was like, where do you even start? The library never felt that way because I generally walked into the library with a goal in mind. But generally speaking, when I walked into the bookstore, I wasn't in search of something. That came later in life, that I'd go in and I'd be like, oh, I want to explore, does so and so have a new book out? To some degree, it's astonishing to me because I think I take it for granted, my relationship to reading. And then I talk to other people my age who don't have this history with reading. And I'm like, huh, right?
This is something that's really important that you touch upon. Taking your love of reading, your love affair with reading for granted is really important because I think this whole episode, if there's a growth for us here, if there's something not necessarily new, but to see with fresh eyes around is our enthusiasm for it, our love of it, our way of entering into larger worlds and truths through novels and other forms. I do take that for granted. There's that part of me that goes, oh yeah, everybody has a version of this, right? And over time, within adulthood, you bring up a really good point. Other people your age, you realize that they are not engaged in what could be called, leisure reading or really reading for pleasure. My childhood best friend, who had also read the Philip Pullman novels, he doesn't really read for pleasure anymore as an adult, almost 40 years old. He read more than me when I was a kid, right? When we were reading a lot of the same books. And I think that that's something that I haven't really reflected on it very deeply. When I go back and I consider my journey, it's inextricably linked to something else. This fact that I actually was telling stories before I could read. I was setting these worlds with all of my toys, my Fisher Price toys, my Brio trains, my Lego sets, and setting up these little hubs, these little dramas within these communities and talking about them and laying them all out and telling my mom when I was 3.5, 4 years old what was going on in the town that I had made. And that started to take shape into telling stories. So dictating a story and having my mom or dad write that down because I didn't know how to read or write at that point. So I was engaged with this literary space, right? The storytelling, the nurturing that we're talking about, even before my ability to read words was fully developed. And it took a little while. Now, you brought up a lot of really important stories in your childhood and adolescence. And one thing that I want to note here is the multimedia aspect of it, right? That a lot of these things came to you through movies first and then books. And this was similar for me. Growing up in the 1990s, Star Wars was very important to me. Now, for reference, this is between movies, and it all often seemed like Star Wars was kind of dead, culturally speaking. It really wasn't a part of the conversation. But it started to come back first through books. And so as I'm learning to read, I'm reading these chapter books that are for kids my age, 7, 8, 9 years old. But I really want to read the adult novels. Those feel more robust. They feel more real, right? The sense of more room, more space for a character's inner thoughts. So at the same time, there's this desire from me to engage with that work. And Jurassic Park, Steven Spielberg's adaptation of Michael Crichton's novel, was coming out. 1993, summer of 1993, everything is Jurassic Park. Everything's dinosaurs. If you were a kid at that point, it is not only your whole world, it's every other child between the ages of 4 and 18. Really, it goes all the way. Now I saw the movie and I knew that it was based off of a novel, an adult novel, a novel that was 450 pages long, full of all these scientific ideas or pseudo-scientific ideas and kind of fantasies around genetics and making dinosaurs and all this stuff, right? I wanted to read that adult novel. Now, you could go to my parents or you could go to my teachers and they would have different things to say about that, right? My mom and dad fully believed that I could do that because I wanted to do it. My teachers would be like, well, Ben's not at that level yet. So what did I do, Martin? Well, I remember going to a Super Crown Books. This was over in Fairfax in Virginia. And I got a mass market trade paperback of Jurassic Park. And I knew that I would read the book and that it would be a challenge. I deeply understood that. Well, it took me 3.5 months to read that book. All the rest of summer, into the fall, past my 10th birthday. But you know what happened after that? I was reading pretty much only adult novels at that point. The Goosebump books, all these things that were geared towards kids my age were kind of fun and ideas, but the language so much wasn't as interesting. Their depth wasn't the same. So it was because of the choice that I made that I stepped into the space where I was a voracious reader. And over the next few years, as I read a lot of Star Wars books, read a lot of Michael Crichton, I started to learn about how to discover things. And I was really stubborn about that for a few years. I truly was. I didn't want people telling me what to read. And I also didn't go to a public school where we were getting a curriculum. I fully, completely saw reading as a personal choice, as a personal pursuit and passion, right? So at about 13, 14 years old, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings comes in, and other fantasy books that are lighter and easier to read that mimic a lot of his things, like Terry Brooks' Shannara books come in. What happened with Tolkien was this sense of world building that I understood through things like Star Wars, right? World building that I understood through comic books that I had been reading over the years, X-Men and Batman and so forth. But there was a very particular thing that was happening with Tolkien because this was before the movies came out. This was before it became a larger multimedia pop cultural phenomenon. And I saw a person, an author, creating this vast, deep world. And by and large, I think the success of those books is because he loves language so much and because he loves these maps and building out what are on those maps. As an adult, I don't deeply resonate with the characters of those books. I think that they're good archetypes, but they don't fascinate me in the same way anymore. But this was a portal. This was a portal into, like you noted, a place where everything expanded. It was mind blowing, right? But for me, what happened next was even greater. So when Fairhaven School opened, the school that I attended for my high school years, the school that you helped support in its creation, that both of your children attended for a period of time, this school got a library donation. And by that I mean an entire author's library was donated to us. The beauty of this is really incredible. Brian Daley, who was a science fiction and fantasy author and who wrote the radio drama versions of Star Wars. He had passed away recently, and his wife didn't want all of the books to go to waste. So we got this incredible library, and a huge part of that library was science fiction and fantasy. So for the first time, I encountered Ursula K. Le Guin, and it was actually through her young adult fantasy series, A Wizard of Earthsea. So this notion of the author, of somebody sitting down and choosing to create, became greater and greater and greater in my understanding. And I was well into my own journey as a storyteller. But to see the depth of expression that people like Le Guin and Tolkien were bringing was stunning. At that time, being 15, turning 16, there was one book, one author that completely blew my mind, and it was Ray Bradbury. And that book was Fahrenheit 451. In this book is the story of a fireman named Montag. He doesn't put out fires, he starts fires. He burns books. A lot of people are familiar with this book in its basic context. But I think what's really important here is that while this book is about censorship and it was written in the years after World War II, and you had German Nazis burning books and all of that at rallies, what this book is really about is literacy and our willingness to step in to the mystery. Bradbury's talked about that time and time again in interviews over the years. Yes, it's about censorship, right? Yes, it's about authoritarian systems. Yes, it's about people choosing to shut themselves off. See, and I think that's the most important part. I wanted to read the first couple of paragraphs to emphasize the kind of potency and power and poetry of words and how that can open up ourselves to the world, yes, but open us up to ourselves, right? That inner view. I didn't have the language yet, even though I was writing fantasy stories of my own. I didn't have the language yet to really articulate what I felt when I read Fahrenheit 451. Bradbury's simple yet vivid and poetic language was so soul affirming. It was a felt experience. Despite the heavy authoritarian world that these characters live in, these words leap off the page. It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With the brass novel in his fists, with this great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world. The blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. With his symbolic helmet numbered 451 on his stolid head, and his eyes all orange flame with the thought of what came next, he flickered the igniter, and the house jumped in a gorging fire that burned the evening sky red and yellow and black. He strode in a swarm of fireflies. He wanted above all, like the old joke, to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace, while the flapping pigeon-winged books died on the porch and lawn of the house. Well, the books went up in sparkling whirls and blew away on a wind turned dark with burning. Montag grinned, the fierce grin of all men, singed and driven back by flame. He knew that when he returned to the firehouse he might wink at himself, minstrel man, burnt corked, in the mirror. Later, going to sleep, he would feel the fiery smile still gripped by his face muscles in the dark. It never went away, that smile. It never, ever went away, as long as he remembered. So those words, the fact that it was mere moments in linear time, I had never really experienced in reading a novel up until that point at 15, that so much could be said about how someone felt through imagery, right? And how it could be so simple and these everyday things could represent something else entirely. There's such a wonderful poetry to that. And that opened me up to a whole new world of literature, well beyond the genre fiction that I grew up mostly on. And I want to emphasize this as we move on. It didn't take me away from it. I still love science fiction. And if you come to my house, a good portion of our fiction shelf has a lot of that on it, especially Bradbury and Ursula K. Le Guin and Octavia E. Butler and Philip K. Dick and N.K. Jemisin. Fahrenheit 451 opened me up to literature in its fullest, robust sense of it can be anything. And it's actually probably best not to try to classify it. And that's the beauty of, I think, Bradbury. He doesn't necessarily want to be called a science fiction author because of that book or because of the Martian Chronicles, right? This, I think, is very important. How we label and classify things can be helpful in sharing information, but it's not always the best way to share the experience, right?
So as you were sharing your Ray Bradbury experience, your inner experience of it, it took me directly back, almost like clockwork, when I was about 12, and then again when I was 15, and again when I was 17 or 18. I read and then reread Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, this actual copy. It's a beat up trade copy, right? It's described as an Indian history of the American West by D. Brown, and it's from a Native American perspective. In many ways, it blew up my worldview. When I was 12, I understood some of what I read, and then each time I reread it, I understood a little bit more. It very much shifted my perspective. As I look back through time, not just maybe through this life, but the many lives I offer we live, past and present, it connects me back to that quote from Sanmi 451. From womb to tomb, we are bound to others, past and present, and by each crime and every kindness, we birth our future. And in so many ways, reading this book connected me to something in my unknown past, but also informed me around in how I questioned how the world was being presented to me. Because this history, through an Indian perspective, in some ways radicalized me. I no longer saw, as I looked at the way, I was in high school taking American history, I questioned a lot of what I was hearing as I listened to how the news was being presented to me. And so it went, like I more and more questioned the nature of the world as it was being presented to me because of this book. And I'm, as a result, deeply grateful, and why it holds that special place in a different way than what you're describing, but in also a very sort of a deeply aligned way that Bradbury presents in questioning the world around us and how it's being presented. And this thing we hear over and over again in our contemporary world, whenever we hear about something that's being done, it's easy to make the statement, well, just follow the money, right? And it's a jaded perspective. It's sadly a very truthful perspective at the same time. And Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee allowed me, it didn't cause me to lose hope in my fellow man or in the world, but simply to question the stories being told about the world around me.
I absolutely love that because it's a completely different book in its narrative drive. But you're noting something here of it not only blew our worlds wide open, these books, but it caused us to inquire, to look, to ask, to wonder, and to wander, to go back to the wandering thing. And I think this is what's so important about this idea that reading is linear or nonlinear. The book lives in you. You haven't read it in years. I have not read Fahrenheit 451 since when I was falling in love with my partner. One of the first things that we did is we were having long phone calls and stuff. I asked her if I could read it to her. So late at night, over the course of a week, I read about half the book. Then we met, and over that summer, we were just kind of out in the world in love. But that I used the book as a way to communicate things that were important to me because it lived within me. I think this is really key to note because it's easy to look at reading as a passive thing, right? Earlier in the episode, I talked about the integration of the joy, the challenges, the mystery of reading. And I come back to that now when I say it's a creative endeavor. I think that's quite obvious from all the experiences we've shared and questions we've asked around literacy. But there's one really important thing that I want to speak to. How does it feel creative? And for folks that maybe haven't sat down and read a book in a while, I want you to consider how you can pause, how you can reread something, how you can take a note, how you can interpret a description of a place, a person, a poetic turn of phrase, right? Reading is a creative process, it's a democratic process. You're meeting the writer and you're bringing your own life to this, and they have no say in how you're interpreting their work, and yet they are very firm in their choices at the same time.
You're calling it creative, and I think connecting to it in that way through creative life force, I would also refer to it as mystical. Mystical in its connection with the mystery of life, the unknowing or the unknowable, and dwelling in that unknowable in ways that can feel deeply truthful. And I think that's in part why I gravitate toward magical realism, is because it takes us into worlds where, in most instances within magical realism, the author doesn't attempt to explain what's happening.
And we talk about like Murakami and 1Q84. Oh, just to bathe in that kind of mystery and the delight that the characters take in their intuition.
And exactly that celebration of the intuitive and how it can inform us, right? You were talking about that, and we've been dancing around that notion of the intuitive and that notion of how we can wander and wonder, and that those can be states of being that can be experienced in a comfy chair with a beautiful book in front of us.
I love the way that you're phrasing that because it gets to something here that, being well read doesn't mean the same thing for everybody, right? And I want to say that because I want to remind folks, don't let what you perceive to be a good book or a bad book or what you have and haven't read hold you back from following your intuition. We're going to offer you some specific books in the newsletter and on social media that might be really great jumping off points if you're seeking to get back into reading for pleasure. But there are a few things that I want to note here as we wrap up. Martin, you talked a lot about the local library. And while I didn't mention that in my sharing of my childhood, that too was paramount. And right now, when we talk about the world that we live in and our access to things and our civil liberties and rights, the library is at risk. But if you go and use your library, that tells state funding, oh, we still got to fund the library. People are using it. So let's start there. Over any books or authors that we've mentioned today and any that we're going to recommend in the newsletter or on socials, the one thing that I feel absolutely confident in offering you, our listeners, who want to get back into reading, who feel inspired, who feel that call, and maybe you felt it before the episode today, simply go to your local library or your local bookshop and browse the shelves. Slow down and explore. Follow your intuition, yes. And also let this be a tactile experience, a felt experience. Feel the weight and the shape of a lot of different kinds of books. Consider their smell. I mean, that's a part of their history too, that particular copy of that book. Lean into your edges. We've talked about, the challenges of reading from a variety of points, right? How we meet those challenges. If you've picked up a book at the bookshop or the library that feels challenging, that hits on something that you feel a little uncomfortable about, maybe that book is going to be the most exciting one to read. Maybe that book is going to be that mind-blowing, world-expanding experience that we've been talking about today. Be open, follow the breadcrumbs of your intuition, and you will not only will you find new perspectives and truths from others, you'll be sitting with yourself in a quiet space, smiling, an inner smile, because you've nurtured something that is at the core of being human. Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.